everyone. Good morning, good day, good afternoon, good evening from wherever you are. We're so pleased to have so many of you with us here today for today's episode of This is CDR. This is CDR is an online event series presented by OpenAir, where we explore the wide range of carbon dioxide removal solutions currently being researched, developed, and deployed, and contextualize them for policy proposals we have under development for New York and other states and jurisdictions. Everyone, please feel free to introduce yourself in the chat. I'm Toby Bryce. I'm in Brooklyn, New York, and I apologize in advance. We have a bit of a thunderstorm happening here, but very pleased to have you here. I work on CDR policy advocacy with OpenAir. Some quick background on OpenAir. We are a distributed volunteer network dedicated to the advancement of carbon dioxide removal solutions essential to solving the climate crisis. Our growing global community collaborates on shared open source missions in the areas of research and development, policy advocacy, and activist market and business development. I believe there's some links in the chat to our website where you can sign a form and join our Discord server. And we'd love to have you follow us on Twitter and have you be a part of what we're doing here at OpenAir. Just a quick word on CDR. Quick definition, CDR is removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and durably storing it in geological, terrestrial, or ocean reservoirs or in long-lived products. When we're considering CDR as we are today and with this series, it's critical to call out first and foremost and upfront that CDR is in no way a substitute for decarbonizing our economy and reducing our emissions. We must do that full stop as quickly as possible, as completely as possible to solve the climate crisis. That said, every credible climate forecast, including in very stark terms, the most recent IPCC report shows that CDR will be required at gigaton scale, that's billions of tons per year, by mid-century to counteract difficult to abate or inequitable to abate emissions, and ultimately to start removing the tremendous excess of anthropogenic CO2 that we have already put up into our atmosphere. So we can restore our climate to a safer, healthier state. That's why we're here today. If you're new to CDR, the link below, the CDR primer, is a great resource. All of our past sessions, we've done 7 or 8 of them at this point, are available on YouTube, and there are tons of resources online to learn more about CDR, and that's why we're here today, to dig in. So I want to pass it on to my colleague Megha, who will introduce today's session.
Hey everyone, I'm Megha Raghavan, based in London, but I actually also work on OpenAir's CDR policy advocacy team with a particular interest in the legislative policy opportunity for California, which is where I'm from. This week, we're very happy to welcome Chris Magwood, Director of the Endeavor Center, to provide an overview of the carbon sequestration opportunity in our built environment. Some housekeeping notes, as always, our format will be a 15 to 20 minute presentation, followed by a few prepared questions, and then we'll have some moderated Q&A from the audience. So please type any questions that you do have into Zoom's Q&A box as we go along. Note that it's separate from the chat box, so just look for the one that's labeled Q&A. The event is being recorded, so we'll send that video link out to everyone who registered, and we'll also post it to OpenAir's website and to our YouTube channel, as Toby mentioned. We'll also be live tweeting today's event, so we'll put our Twitter link in the chat if it's not already in there. And please follow along. If you tweet, the event hashtag is going to be This is CDR. So now to the main event. So Chris Magwood is the founder of the Endeavor Center, and he teaches in the Sustainable Building and Design Program, Natural Building Intensive, and many workshops where he enjoys sharing what he's learned over his 25-year building career and inspiring others to take this stuff seriously and to do it very well. Chris has authored 7 books on sustainable building, including Essential Sustainable Home Design in 2017, Essential Hempcrete Construction in 2016, and Making Better Buildings in 2014, as well as contributed a chapter to the book, The New Carbon Architecture. He's the co-editor of the Sustainable Building Essential series from New Society Publishers. And he's currently at work on a new book, Building Beyond Zero, New Ideas for Carbon Smart Architecture, published by Island Press. Chris recently completed his MA at Trent University, studying carbon storage potential of the built environment. His thesis, Opportunities for Carbon Capture and Storage in Building Materials, was published in April 2019. Chris is an active speaker and workshop instructor in Canada and internationally. Chris, over to you.
Great, thanks Megha, and thanks everybody for coming out and listening to this today. I'm just gonna get my screen share going here. And hopefully that's now good. Yeah, thanks for coming and spending whatever part of the day it happens to be in whatever part of the world you are in. I'm going to be talking about buildings, building materials as part of the CDR opportunity that we need to explore and take up if we're going to successfully tackle these climate issues that we're faced with. And I'm going to try to pack quite a bit into this 20 minutes. And hopefully if some of it goes too quickly or I'm not able to be clear in that amount of time, we can take that up in the discussion session that will follow. So I was well introduced. Thank you, Mega. So I won't spend any time there. I want to just very quickly say that even though I've been working in what I guess most people call environmentally friendly building my entire career, it was in early, I think, 2012 when my young teenage daughter at the time sort of asked me if any of the stuff that I was doing, was that going to make any difference to the climate? And, we've also heard from lots of prominent young women like the two on the screen. And so the deep dive that I started to take into the climate impacts of the kind of building that I was already doing is a result of, trying to answer for this upcoming generation that has plenty of reason to be asking me and my generation to do a whole lot better than we have been doing. So I have a 25-year career in designing and building using a lot of ag residues, timber, and earthen materials, and have had a chance to work with all kinds of really interesting residential and commercial and institutional building owners, really trying to think seriously about the impact of the environment of their buildings. But like I said, for a lot of the time of that career, what's the actual carbon footprint of what we're doing wasn't a question that we were directly asking. In the building sector, we have been putting all of our focus onto the emissions that come from building operations. And for good reason, they make up a pretty high percentage of the planet's overall carbon emissions. But we have, as an industry, completely missed the material emissions. It's only within the last couple of years that this has started to get any serious consideration within the industry. And as people started, trying to do the math on, well, what does all of the production of building materials add up to? It's pretty significant. It's, somewhere in the neighborhood of 20% of all emissions on the planet come from making building materials. And the important thing to remember when we are emitting making building materials is that, we're emitting all the carbon footprint of that building, at the beginning of its lifespan. With building operations, we can clean up energy sources, we can retrofit buildings, we can work to reduce the ongoing operating emissions of buildings, but we can't make much impact on materials that have already been made. So there's this kind of upfront piece that, even though it's maybe not quite as big globally, a slice of the pie, it happens now, and we have to tackle it now. So a lot of the sort of initial work that I did, I'm in the residential building space. So I'm looking at, anything from small multi-unit buildings, 4 stories and under, down to single family homes. And in my work, looking at the sort of Canadian and American context for those buildings, it's pretty typical for a home to have emissions of about 250 kilograms of CO2e per square meter of floor area. And what that means is that the annual share of emissions that come from making the materials for American single-family homes is about 60 million tons. So this is not a trifling amount of emissions. And really, we need to think about what that means. It's the equivalent of a year's worth of emissions from 14.5 million cars or 30 to 40 coal plants. So, all of that happens annually. And, as incentives now, both in Canada and the US, start arriving to build more homes, these numbers are only going to go up unless we do something about it. So, the question is, can we actually do better than that. And from my career and from the career of lots of people, in particular, who've been building with agricultural residues, we do believe that there is a really strong way to be able to address that. So my initial study kind of looked at a couple of housing types, a small apartment building and a single family home. And if we took the exact same building, the same performance specs, the same code compliance, all of those kind of things normalized, and just switched out materials, we saw that there was this huge range of potential impacts on the climate from that building. From over here on the far right, this is a sort of high efficiency net zero style home that built with high emitting materials, could have over 400 kilograms of emissions per square meter associated with its materials. And over here on the far right, an example of a building that could have net storage of over 170 kilograms per square meter. So, there's this vast range of possible outcomes, but really encouraging to see that there is a pathway to outcomes where buildings don't only we're going to do slightly less bad for the climate, where we can actually, see buildings as a CDR opportunity. So there's really two ways that we can put carbon into buildings. One is through photosynthesis, and one is through carbonate mineralization. I'll look quickly at both, but the majority of the presentation today is going to be looking at the photosynthetic options, simply because there are more of them and they're sort of more fully developed. Although I think the potential for carbonate mineralization is huge too. So on that front, there are a few interesting things going on right now. The manufacturing of concrete, in particular, Portland cement, which is the glue that holds all the rocks and sand together in concrete, is alone responsible for somewhere around 8% of global emissions. So, working to fix concrete in terms of its climate impact is really important. And a couple, really interesting pathways that are being explored now are biological forms of concrete, where we essentially use living organisms to grow concrete, whether they're microbes in the case of Biomason, or algae in the case of what's coming from Living Materials Lab, to essentially use those organisms that draw carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and turn it into back into rock, essentially. So really interesting things going on there. BioLith from Biomason is now available in tile and brick form, and hopefully coming soon as a ready mix form. So I would expect these developments to really move forward in the years to come. The other thing that's really exciting in this space is aggregates that are made out of recaptured carbon. So whether it's Blue Planet that's making synthetic limestone aggregate, they're basically capturing CO2 from emission stacks and recarbonizing it into rocks that then become the aggregate portion of the concrete. OCO is doing the same, but using mining tailings and other industrial wastes that can be carbonated. The interesting thing here is that, while the focus tends to be on Portland cement in concrete, because that's where the bulk of the emissions come from, the bulk of the volume is the aggregate. It's the rocks and gravel and sand that make up the bulk of it. So if we can turn the aggregate portion of concrete into viable carbon storage, then the amount of material that we could start storing would be really high. So Blue Planet is working on their first full-scale plant right now. And again, this is something that we're not going to be able to use tomorrow, but it's really close and really exciting. So all kinds of stuff happening in this space, and as that transformation happens, the potential for buildings to be carbon storage vessels will increase dramatically. what I'm going to be focused on are the photosynthetic versions. And we've taken to really thinking about them in 4 quite distinct categories, because I think each of these categories has its own methodology for figuring out what the value of that carbon storage is. And the 4 categories would be agricultural residues. So that would include things like straw, bagasse, hemp hurd, rice hulls, seaweed, corn stover, nutshells. There's a huge range of things that we already grow on the planet. We grow food to eat, and almost everything we grow has a pretty significant proportion of residue involved. And those residues are, carbon that was captured out of the atmosphere within the last year for most agricultural products. And so offers a huge potential for putting that away instead of burning it or rotting it and having it go back into the atmosphere. And then there's also waste stream fibers, things that are in our recycling systems now, or that can or should be, things like paper, cardboard, textiles, and there are all kinds of products that are already underway from being able to, from that line. Then there are some purpose-grown crops, and here the carbon storage part, the math gets a little trickier because we have to attribute the full scale of all the carbon emissions that happen to grow these crops to the material. They do, most of the ones that I've looked at still tend to offer net carbon storage, but one of the things that we want to make sure in promoting photosynthetic materials for buildings is that we don't end up displacing croplands or cutting down forests in order to purpose grow building materials. So there's a bit more nuance involved as we explore purpose grown crops. And then of course there's timber, which is actually would top most people's lists because, largely in the architecture world, timber is kind of seen as the only photosynthetic building material, and the huge degree of interest in mass timber and cross-laminated timber solutions is really encouraging. However, timber is also, of all of these types, the most problematic to understand as carbon removal and storage, because our forests are huge reservoirs of carbon storage. And if we are simply taking carbon from a forest, where if we take the tree out, you're actually maybe robbing that forest of the potential to increase its storage pool, and then putting that in a building, we may not be doing anything great for the climate. Whereas if we're able to grow the size of the forest and extract timber and put those timber into buildings, then we're doing something great. And so we have to be really careful when thinking about timber, that there's a big sort of it depends around how we value that storage. So like I said, there are all kinds of materials, photosynthetic based materials out there. Some have been typical in the building industry for a really long time. Some are quite new. Some are sort of just at the R&D stage. Some have been used for decades, but aren't sort of part of mainstream construction. But the variety of options is vast. We've been building out a database of carbon storing materials with Builders for Climate Action. And right now we're at about 130 different products that are already available for use in buildings. So, not all of these are upfront and visible to everybody, but there's a lot of different options out there. I'll just point to grain straw as one example. And, from the world of ag residues, there are many different examples. But you can see how much grain straw is grown annually. So we eat the wheat, the oats or the barley off the top of that plant, and the stalk is left over. But essentially the global grain production every year results in 4 billion tons of CO2 drawdown into that straw. That's the equivalent of all the greenhouse gases from India. And by and large, we just let all of that carbon go back into the atmosphere. but we could replace every insulation material being used on the planet with just straw-based insulation materials, still leave the 20% of the straw harvest that needs to go back into the soil to keep that healthy. And around the world, there are all kinds of straw products already being made and used and implemented. So this is just one look at one way that one type of ag residue is being used, and we can multiply that by the literally hundreds of different options that are out there. I'm going to go through this fairly quickly, but what I would like to do is sort of like look at the life cycle phase of typical construction materials. So I'm mapping that here in red, where the harvesting, the manufacturing, the transportation, the construction, they all result in emissions happening. So discharges to the atmosphere, whether that's from fossil fuels being used in those processes, chemical reactions that are happening in those processes, transportation, fuel use for heating, all those sorts of things. They all add up to a bunch of emissions, which means that, for the lifespan of a building, that building is already responsible for that many emissions when it's built. And of course, those emissions stay in the atmosphere and so, continue to drive climate change. At the end of that building's life, if we're able to recycle some of that material, we may offset some future emissions. But we may end up landfilling or incinerating that and causing more emissions. The thing that's important to remember is that it's not the sort of number at the end of that lifespan that matters. It's the area under the red line. Once the emissions go into the atmosphere, they're there driving climate change. And so, when we think about the impacts of materials, we have to sort of see it as cumulative over the lifespan of the building. With the photosynthetic materials, we usually have a small burst of emissions when those are planted. We have a period of photosynthetic drawdown while that plant is growing. The time frame on that could be, a few months for something like a wheat straw to many decades for a tree. And then we have the same set of emissions. So, harvesting, manufacturing, transportation, construction all put emissions back into the atmosphere. But for every material that I've mapped out so far, what happens is that those emissions are less than the amount of CO2 that was drawn down as the plant was growing. And so when we bundle that up and put it in a building for 40 years, 60 years, 80 years, 100 years, whatever that building lives to be, that's a sort of net removal of CO2 from the atmosphere for that period of time. And so, the meaningful carbon storage is now, again, the area above the line. It matters that carbon is gone and gone for quite some space of time. And the difference between building with conventional materials and biologically based materials is the sort of difference between that red line and the green line. And so there's a real impact that we can make by focusing on this. At the end of life for biological photosynthetic materials, there are a whole bunch of options, some of which continue the carbon storage for a long period of time, and others of which, in the worst case scenario, result in emissions going back into the atmosphere. So as I've started to take this notion of carbon storage in building materials to people who are climate scientists and asking, what does this mean? How do we view this kind of carbon storage that is temporary, but temporary measured in decades or a century or so versus temporary as in being like a year or two or under a decade. And I've been sort of turned towards this notion of ton-year accounting, where essentially, the pulse of 1 ton of CO2, it has an impact in the atmosphere over 100 years of 46 ton years of damage. And so that means that if we can store a ton of carbon instead of emitting that ton of carbon for at least 46 years, then we've done the same as not emitting that pulse in the first place. So, when the area of the yellow section and the area of the green section are equal, you've done equal work in terms of the impact on the climate. And because buildings do have, even in the sort of short version of their lifespans, where we're, sometimes attributing only 40 years or so of lifespan, that's getting really close to the full value of carbon storage. So what that means is when that carbon comes out of the building, if it goes back to the atmosphere, it's a new emission, and that's problematic, and we should make sure that doesn't happen. But it's done its work as an offset of an emission over that period of time. And so you can see here how we can use ton-year accounting to value the emissions or the offset, depending on how long it's resident in the building. So if we have a very short-lived material, I can't think of anything that would only last a year. This ton-year accounting would say if you put 100 tons in the building, it's worth 2.17 tons as a credit. If the material lasts 20 years, like maybe say a cork flooring or something like that, it's getting close to being worth half the value. And if we're able to keep it in the building sort of between the 40 and 50 year mark, it's worth the full value of the carbon we put away. And if we can keep it there even longer, as is the case with most buildings, we're actually doing more work for the climate than the 100 tons that we put in. So that's kind of the rationale that we're using. And there are some carbon markets starting to be set up, in particular to sell storage in buildings. And Aureus Earth is a great example of that. They just put out a really great white paper on their methodology. So if you're interested in the actual market value of this, you could check that out. One of the things that I do like to sort of point out is that from my previous practice, I'm really making sure that, or wanting to make sure that in trying to do the right thing for the climate, that I'm not doing the wrong thing for in other ways, that there aren't unintended consequences. And I think actually with these photosynthetic materials, what I found was the opposite, that when I looked at the other sort of metrics by which we can measure impact, the biological materials are actually a lot better overall than their conventional counterparts. So, none of the photosynthetic materials that I looked at in my study or that we use in our own practice have any red list chemicals in them, which means great for the occupants of the building to not be exposed to any toxins, great for the environment to not have those things created in the first place or to have waste that reintroduces them. There's many more opportunities for getting these products sourced locally, whether it's through agricultural byproducts, forestry residues, or municipal recycling programs. And that regional manufacturing also becomes a lot more attractive. A lot of these materials aren't very expensive and can be turned into products quite easily. And that actually works better at a smaller, more regional scale. So the potential for investments in smaller and rural areas where the materials are being generated really exists. And that the waste from these materials is by and large biodegradable and or can be used for fuel or other ways, but doesn't create landfill or toxic waste. So I'm going to wrap up quickly with just a look at some projects that are actually putting this into practice. These first ones are ours, where at Endeavour Center, we take on building projects that we design and build with our students. And this is an example of a building, a little demo home that we built. And here we wanted to not only maximize the carbon storage in the building, so this is a little 1,100 square foot house that actually stores 5 tons of CO2 net in it, but we also wanted to show that it's possible to make sure that that carbon storage doesn't have to come to an end when you don't want this building in its current location anymore. And we did that by panelizing the building and taking it down and putting it up 3 different times, so that the main reason that buildings actually get demolished is that it's the wrong building in the wrong place, and it's not really failure of the building structurally. And so if we can start to think about not only using carbon storing materials, but using them in a way where you can dismantle the pieces and use them either in this case as a whole again, or take the pieces and use them in different forms. That means we sort of extend the lifespan of that carbon. We also recently were on the team that made the new forensic crime scene facility at Trent University here in Ontario. And this 4,500 square foot building ended up with just under 7 tons of net storage in it, based largely on some of the hemp-based materials we use, the hemp blocks that you can see in the photo, as well as hemp bat insulation and a number of other biological materials that were included in that building. And I wanted to show you this because that Trent building, we modeled it as it was going to be built at the university, and it was going to have over 211 tons of emissions associated with the materials. When we finished with the design, we calculated the footprint of the building in 2 ways. One where we valued only the agricultural residues as carbon storage. And in that case, we reduced the carbon footprint by 88% and got it down to 25 tons. And if we included the timber, which we sourced from sustainable sources here in Ontario, that brought the net storage down to just under 7 tons. So, sometimes how you do the math and what you count makes a difference, but you can see even if we're not counting wood, there's a massive difference that can be made and can be done with materials that are available today and code compliant. And as is the case with a lot of climate stuff, the Europeans are way ahead of us in this. So there are, I'll just show you very quickly, a number of projects. This large business park in the UK uses Mod Cells prefabricated straw bale panels. This large Marks and Spencer store uses prefabricated hempcrete panels and a laminated timber frame. This university building in Nottingham also uses prefab straw bale panels that they made on site. This residence building in France, it's a 7-story, 36-unit apartment building, is also made with a timber frame and prefabricated straw bale panels. And this school, also in France, similarly made from a timber frame and site-made prefabricated straw bale panels. So that's the presentation. I know if there are a lot of architects on the line, there may be a lot of questions about how you build with these materials and the details of them. I was trying to stick to the notion of carbon storage in buildings, but I'm happy to get into the weeds. And just a quick note, this, if you go to buildersforclimateaction.org, we just put out this report with Natural Resources Canada, sort of looking at this in the sort of context of Canadian homes. So if you sort of want to dive into a bunch of numbers and stats and stuff, it's a great report. And I just, somewhere along the line, my camera stopped working, Toby. So I'm not sure why I'm not appearing. When I go to the start video, it says you don't have a camera. I did when I started, but I didn't intentionally disappear. But
well, the important thing is that we can hear you, and that was a really fantastic presentation. So thank you so much. And we do have quite a few audience questions, just a handful of prepared questions to start with, and then we'll flip it to Mega, who will ask some of these audience questions. But thank you again. That was really, really inspiring and informative. I'm going to audible a little bit because you covered a couple of the questions that we had prepared. But as I was listening, with your initial focus, at least on residential, can you talk a little bit about how some of these materials can scale to a city level, whether through larger buildings? Toward the end, you definitely showed some examples of larger buildings that are employing these materials, but maybe walk through some of the materials you talked about and their scale potential. That would be pretty helpful, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I think the scale potential is huge, and that's why I included those European things right at the end, because really they haven't been put to use at scale in North America yet. Although I'm pretty sure we're smart and talented enough to be able to do that, but there just hasn't been that kind of push here to try to do that. But a lot of what I showed there were sort of wall panels, insulation panels, a lot of them based on straw, some of them on hemp. But that is, the reason they're there is because that's both, those two ways of using ag residues are both, the raw material exists in huge quantities all over the world, and the know-how to be able to put it into practice is already there. So, those are really easy ones to point to. There's been a lot of work in Germany with using waste wood fiber board panels to both insulate new buildings, but also to wrap old buildings, sort of making an insulation wrap with wood fiber board. That's been done at quite large scale, like 15, 20-story buildings that are being wrapped in wood fiber board there. There is a wood fiber board manufacturer starting up, Go Labs, on the northeast coast of the US. So hopefully, people have been importing that material, but we certainly have the resources to be making it here. The list kind of goes on and on. There's, a lot of things are pretty simple for indoor partitions. There are compressed straw boards that are like a clip together interior wall system, which is a great way to incorporate this kind of material inside a building, where if you're an architect and concerned about weathering or, how do these things last, there are all kinds of ways that biological materials can end up in buildings as well. It's a company in California that makes a really great product called Rewall, which is a drywall replacement made from compressed drinking boxes from the recycling stream. Cellulose insulation has been around for decades, and is a great way to do that. So, like, literally, we have this database of 100 plus products that are already out there. I think it's really a matter of, so far the main reasons for somebody wanting to use that has been, I want to do the right thing for the environment, sort of more generally. But I'm seeing that the sort of the climate concern is driving a lot more adoption than the kind of, do the right thingism of 10, 20 years ago. And especially if we can start to actually see and directly value that carbon storage, then I think, there's a whole, bunch of industries ready to explode to kind of fill that demand.
Great. And that's a really good segue to what I wanted to ask next. So as I mentioned up front, part of Open Air's purpose in putting this event series on is to think about and consider and talk about carbon dioxide removal in the context of public policy. And specifically, we're developing a state level CDR procurement policy. And one of the key attributes and requirements for the policy is permanence of storage. And you talked quite a bit about that in your presentation, but and permanence is fairly clear in the case of concrete, or if we're making carbon fiber steel or something like that. But can you walk through again, maybe recap what permanence or durability we can be thinking about in terms of some of these biomass-based materials, perhaps starting with CLT and mass timber. So the Puro.Earth marketplace, and I haven't actually looked at how Aureus is doing this, but in Puro.Earth, for example, in Europe, has a 50-year permanence on CLT. And so if a public policy has, for example, a 100-year durability threshold, can you talk about how some of the biomass-based materials might qualify for that?
Yeah, I mean, I think, it's the materials themselves aren't in any danger of going back to the atmosphere in anything, less than 100 years, unless we do that to them, right? Like every building that we build now has the potential to last at least a century, if not more. So really, it's so hard to talk about the durability of a building or the durability of that storage when it has nothing to do with the viability of the material. It has to do with how much is that real estate worth, and does somebody want to keep that building there, or do they want to junk it and replace it with something else? So to me, there's two things. One is, recognizing that 50 years worth of storage is, a complete offset of that ton. Like if we can put it in a building for 50 years, at the end of 50 years, it's done its job. But as it comes out of the building, I think the built environment has some really interesting things. One is you can't take a building down without permits. And so, it's very easy for us to identify when that's going to happen and for us to regulate what happens to the stuff that comes out of that building. So, if we can't guarantee that the building is going to last more than 50 years, we can certainly guarantee a process by which that carbon is handled as it leaves that building. And, if it can be put in a new building or reused and its storage value continues, that's great. If it's not, then, maybe that triggers that somebody has to now pay for that carbon, in order to take it out. But I think because the built environment is so regulated, it's actually a fairly easy place to be able to intervene and make sure that carbon, continues to be valued beyond the lifespan of the building.
And so with the proper regulation, are there any of the biomass-based materials that you referenced that don't have, the building lifespan aside, the stability and the durability to if recycling and reuse is mandated, that they could meet that threshold?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, at the very least, they can all be pelletized and turned into fuel and then, the carbon captured on the other side. But, the basic cellulose structure of all of those materials doesn't degrade over time. Like a piece of straw doesn't get smaller and gradually, carbon falls off it. It continues to store that carbon until we do something to stop it from being a straw, whether that's burn it, rot it, feed it to something. So I don't think that the only materials that would have that kind of thing would be materials that do physically wear, things like flooring, things like cladding, where due to actual abrasion or environmental degradation, do both lose some of that carbon storage, but also need to be replaced. But I do think that there are, really great options already and lots to be done in the future to make sure that we don't just throw those things out at the end of that lifespan, that they, we value that carbon and continue to hold on to it in a useful way.
Got it. One other quick follow-up question on CDR procurement policy, and then we're going to flip it to the audience because there are tons of questions there. So another requirement of a CDR procurement policy is that the CDR that's being credited or procured be additional. And so how can we think about additionality in terms of the use of some of these products? I think it's a little clearer and concrete if you're capturing CO2 from the air and either creating Blue Planet type aggregate or injecting it into the mix like a CarbonCure does. But what about some of these biomass-based materials, and how can we sort of ensure additionality if we're going to be providing a credit for their use?
Right. I mean, I'm probably not the best person to like. I'm not a procurement person or a climate policy person. I'm a builder and a material person. But right now that the vast majority of those fibers that are sort of produced on the planet, we know how long it takes them to end up back in the atmosphere. It's a pretty short cycle. So keeping them out does seem like it's an additional storage. If those 4 billion tons of wheat straw every year are either burned or moldered, if we take that and then put them in buildings, that's something that was not happening previously. It's both offsetting an emission that was going to happen and putting that carbon into storage. But I think better brains than mine on climate policy need to think about that. But that is why we are thinking about those materials in those 4 categories I said, because I think the way that you might view that additionality would be different based on what the source of the material is. If it's coming from the waste stream, how is that carbon valued, or was it valued going into its initial product? What may have happened to it if it didn't turn into a building product? There's a whole bunch of questions, whereas the ag residue stuff seems pretty clear that this was going to get burnt, then it didn't get burnt, it went into a building. And then I think that's where timber gets really confusing, because, what's happening in the particular forest where that wood came from makes the difference between that wood potentially being a net emitter and that wood being a net storer. So I think, there would need to be, a lot more clarity, all around in terms of how you go about valuing this.
Right. And that's, I know, apologies for the difficult, possibly unanswerable question, but I think that's a really thoughtful.
Yeah, no, and I appreciate it. And it's, it's things that I'm starting to think about that I've never had to think about, because at first I just wanted to build with this stuff. So it's,
right.
Yeah.
And I think ultimately a lot of these biomass-based materials are going to be kind of in the middle ground, because ultimately for CDR, you want to be taking the emitted CO2 and restoring it to the geosphere. So we're kind of in a middle ground with some of these biomass-based materials, but if they get it out of the atmosphere for 100 years, that's obviously going to be a big win and very important. So thank you for that answer. Megha, do you want to hop on and start fielding some of these audience questions?
Yeah, absolutely. So we have a bunch. I'm just going to more or less go through in order. One of the first questions was, what would be the effect of made on purpose calcium carbonate, so aggregates and concrete or tiles of the Earth's atmosphere becoming more and more acidic as a result of silicon oxide emissions or acid rain? For example, South Africa recently built coal-fired power stations that have an expected economic life of 40 years. China is doing something similar.
I don't think I can answer that. That's
okay.
That's well beyond my capabilities to answer. I think where that carbon is being drawn from is key. And in the case of, say, the algae concrete, that's literally just straight from the atmosphere through the algae and into the product, versus some sort of industrial collection on the sort of Blue Planet side, and what that industry is, and what's happening with other emissions from that industry. Yeah, there's lots of detail there, but to me, I just see the sort of literally billions of tons of aggregate that we put in buildings every year. If we can make that a carbon sink, that would seem to be really valuable, even once we answer all of those other questions about other emissions.
Right. Okay. Another question that came in was about insulation materials. So how does grain straw insulation that you reference compare to other insulation products out there on the market currently?
In terms of its thermal performance, it's kind of the equivalent of mineral-based insulation. And, that's worthy of an hour-long webinar all on its own. There's a lot of really interesting building science things that happen when you start using bio-based insulations around vapor permeable assemblies and the durability of those versus materials that don't allow moisture to be stored and released from the material. But essentially the oldest, say, straw-based buildings in the world are the first ones that were built in Nebraska around the late 1800s, early 1900s. There's a whole bunch of them still standing and still functional, despite being pretty primitive in terms of their construction techniques. So, we know that even not handled well, that material has a century or more of lifespan to it. And certainly, when we put it in a more modern context where we, have rain screens and we have flashing and we have all the stuff we need, we've been building around the world with wood for a long time. And, what I like to say to people with any other bio-based material is, if you're confident that your wood framing in your building is going to last 100 years or more, so will any of the bio-based materials that you're putting around it. Like they're all actually the same. A grain straw is just a little tree. So, if you think that the big tree you're using is going to last, then the little tree right next to it will also last, exactly the same length of time.
Right. Okay. A few people asked about fire or combustibility, so I'm just going to read those throughout. So one was, how combustible are the hemp building blocks? How do you deal with the flammability of the materials? And how do you deal with the fire hazard associated with organic materials?
Right. Yep, I was surprised that wasn't the very first question. It usually is. And, the answer is different. Like, I'm sort of talking about this huge range of materials, and all of them have different fire properties. So for example, the hempcrete, each of those little pieces of hemp hurd is actually coated in hydraulic lime. And so it's literally coated in stone and is, in its fire test, it's basically, fireproof. You can use that as a fire block type wall. So, that's one example. Most of the straw-based ones, all of these materials have obviously passed all the fire testing requirements. When you see them in a building, they're there because, they were shown to be fire resistant. So, straw bale construction has its own appendix in the International Residential Code in the US, and, a whole series of fire tests that go with that. Essentially, it's all strategy based. The materials aren't, say, any more flammable. I mean, one of the main insulations we use is petrochemical foam. That's a fire accelerant material that we figured out how to both treat and then put in a context where it's not a fire hazard. And, the same approach can happen with, any bio-based material, which is actually starts out less prone to fire than the petrochemicals do and can be made to, at least equal, if not exceed, everything that the code requires of material. But, the context is always different. What kind of building, in what place in the building, under what conditions. But, clearly nobody would be putting materials like that into a building that hadn't been explored quite well and knowing that they were meeting the fire requirements.
Right. Okay. One quick question that someone had, and maybe if you have an answer, Chris or Toby can find the link and drop it in the chat. Someone asked if there's a list out there of the 130 biogenic materials that you mentioned.
Yeah, we should have that up on the Builders for Climate Action website soon. We're just sort of, we just have somebody kind of combing through it and making sure the links are all live and that it's, kind of good to go. But, relatively soon, within a month or so, that will be a resource that we have there.
Okay, got it. Someone also asked what kind of software, if any, do you use for like the LCA and the different carbon calculations for the building materials that you've been showing?
That's been sort of evolving over my work with this, but right now we're actually using a tool that we helped build ourselves. The report that's up on screen that we did with Natural Resources Canada, we built a residential construction specific tool for measuring that. And that will be publicly available again very soon, both from Builders for Climate Action and Natural Resources Canada. So that was sort of made to fill a gap in the market for sort of low-rise buildings. Right. But there are lots of software. Tally has been a go-to for us for larger buildings. But One Click LCA, the Athena Impact Estimator, those are all tools that are out there.
Okay, great. And someone actually, I guess, on that vein, someone asked, acknowledging that your focus is more on residential buildings, are you able to comment on recalcitrant quasi-graphitic carbons such as biochar used in things like road pavement or an asphalt or other types of infrastructure?
Not so much on its use in those things, but certainly there's been a lot of work in the last few years with biochar in concrete, in plaster, in gypsum-based materials. On its own, we saw a really amazing cherry pit biochar that would make a great aggregate or a great sub-slab insulation. So yeah, I think there are lots of places where biochar can and will end up fitting into the built environment, and all the benefits that it sort of has in its other forms can I think be pretty easily translated into building materials.
Great. And I think we'll finish with one last one. So someone mentioned that one problem they've seen is that the building and construction industry is rather fixed on what they already know, and asks, how can these practices become more mainstream?
Well, that's the question that I've been spending my life trying to figure out. I'm not sure I have a great answer, but I do think that the potential to actually have some value attached to the carbon in these materials is one thing that could help a lot. If I'm a builder thinking about trying out a new material and it's just plain going to cost me more in every way. The material costs more, the training my people to use it costs more, but I can't charge the client necessarily more for the building. I'm not going to go down that path. But if there is a something like an Aureus Earth who's actually paying me to put this carbon in the building, then it's kind of taking that financial risk out and adding a whole lot of incentive for people to consider materials that they haven't used before. But that is sort of ongoing question in the building industry is how do you start a shift? You need enough people to adopt a material for it to be viable to be manufactured at scale, but you can't manufacture it at scale until there's enough people that want to use it. And so many good ideas kind of end up falling in that crack where this could be great, but it needs the uptake for it to really take off.
Yeah, makes sense. All right, well, Chris, thanks very much. That was really interesting for me. I'm going to hand over to Toby to just close us out. That was great. Thanks so much.
Yeah, that was great. And on that last one, I mean, I could probably do an entire presentation on that alone. So there was so much material that you covered and it was really interesting. So thank you. This is CDR Continues Weekly. Next week, we have Climeworks, Christoph Bietler from Climeworks, which will be very exciting. He can talk to us about their recent launch of their Orca facility in Iceland. And they have a lot of other great developments upcoming. And he'll also talk about their DAC process. And then for the rest of the month, we have Mars Materials on the 19th. They are a carbon to value company and they can help, their process can make carbon negative steel, basically via carbon fiber. Project Vesta on the 26th. And then in November, we have Running Tide, Charm, Planetary Hydrogen, and Noya. So lots of great stuff coming up. There should be links to our Twitter in the chat. There are links to the series. There's a registration link for next week. So please come back and see us. Thank you so much. And thank you again to Chris Magwood for such a fantastic presentation. Have a great afternoon and evening and day, everyone.